Deep in the administrative bowels of Proxima Station, where the smell of recycled air mixed with the nervous perspiration of 47 different species, the Intergalactic War Academy's most prestigious examination was about to commence. The facility itself was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency. All gleaming metal corridors and holographic displays that hummed with the self-importance of an institution that had produced 3 centuries of military strategists who had successfully avoided any actual wars. The examination hall stretched before the assembled cadets like a metallic cathedral dedicated to the worship of theoretical violence. Each desk was equipped with quantum processors capable of calculating the trajectory of a photon torpedo through 17 dimensions, yet somehow the Academy's coffee machines still managed to produce something that tasted like liquid regret. The irony was not lost on the more observant students, though they wisely kept such observations to themselves. 43 of the galaxy's finest military minds sat in perfectly arranged rows, their various appendages tapping nervously against their desks. There was the usual collection of overachievers, a Zephyrian whose crystalline head structure literally sparkled with intellectual superiority, a Mollusk Coalition representative whose slime trail had been forming increasingly complex geometric patterns throughout the semester, and a Centurion whose 4 arms allowed for the kind of note-taking that made lesser species weep with inadequacy. The Proctor, a distinguished Valdorian whose tentacles had achieved the proper shade of academic purple through decades of scholarly dedication, glided between the rows with the practiced grace of someone who had watched thousands of students discover that their 3 years of strategic studies had prepared them for absolutely nothing. His bioluminescent patches flickered in what those familiar with Valdorian physiology would recognize as barely suppressed amusement. Each student had spent the equivalent of a small moon's GDP on their education, memorizing the 17 classical approaches to interstellar warfare, the 43 recognized forms of diplomatic coercion, and the 812 scenarios that constituted the standard galactic conflict resolution protocols. They could recite the optimal formation for a photon lance assault, calculate the psychological impact of a properly executed orbital blockade, and debate the finer points of quantum mine deployment, until their professors begged for mercy. Yet here they sat, staring at examination tablets that displayed exactly one question. The question itself was deceptively simple, rendered in the standard galactic script that somehow managed to look ominous despite being designed by a committee of linguistic efficiency experts. It read, with the kind of casual indifference that made careers collapse and academic dreams crumble: a coalition of hostile forces threatens galactic stability. All conventional diplomatic and military options have been exhausted. In this scenario, what would Earth do? The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was the kind of profound quiet that suggested the universe itself was holding its breath. Styluses hovered over answer surfaces. Respiratory systems across dozens of species synchronized into a rhythm that suggested collective panic. Even the Centaurian, whose species was renowned for their ability to multitask, seemed to have temporarily forgotten how to use 3 of their 4 arms. This was not their first encounter with the question. Every student in the academy had heard whispers about it, had seen the haunted expressions of graduating classes as they filed out of examination halls, with the hollow-eyed look of those who had glimpsed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of strategic thinking. The question had become something of a legend, a boogeyman that lurked in study groups and turned confident military tacticians into nervous wrecks. The Zephyrian's crystalline structure began emitting a low harmonic frequency that indicated deep philosophical distress. The Molokan representative's slime trail had abandoned geometric patterns entirely, and now resembled something a particularly disturbed abstract artist might have produced during a fever dream. Several students had begun the preliminary motions of what appeared to be prayer, though to which deities remained unclear. Earth. The words sat there on their screens like a cosmic practical joke. Everyone knew about Earth, of course. It was impossible to avoid completely. 3rd planet from an unremarkable yellow star, populated by a species that had somehow managed to split the atom before figuring out how to properly organize their planetary government. The kind of place that sophisticated galactic citizens mentioned with the sort of patronizing tolerance usually reserved for distant relatives who insisted on pursuing careers in interpretive darts. The Academy's comprehensive database contained exactly 47,312 entries about Earth's military capabilities, political structures, and cultural practices. What it did not contain, and what every student was beginning to realize with growing unease, was a single definitive analysis of what Earth would actually do in any given strategic scenario. This was not an oversight. This was not a gap in academic research. This was, as several students were beginning to suspect, with the kind of dawning horror usually reserved for discovering that your life's work had been built on a foundation of cosmic misunderstanding, entirely intentional. The question's origins traced back to the Academy's founding, though accessing those particular historical records required security clearances that most faculty members didn't possess. What was known, whispered in faculty lounges and passed down through generations of increasingly nervous administrators, was that the question had been added to the examination after what academic records euphemistically referred to as the incident. 3 years prior, a particularly ambitious student from the Rigelian Collective had decided that their dissertation would be the definitive analysis of Earth's military doctrine. The young scholar, whose name had been quietly removed from all academic records, had spent 14 months compiling every available piece of data about human warfare. The resulting document had been exactly 3,478 pages long, contained references to battles spanning 5 millennia, and had concluded with a single sentence that had required the intervention of Academy counselors. Humans appear to treat warfare as a creative endeavor rather than a strategic discipline. The dissertation defense had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds before 3 professors had simultaneously requested emergency sabbaticals, and the head of the Strategic Studies Department had been found in his office staring at a wall display showing human military formations while muttering something about tactical improvisation and complete disregard for established doctrine. 7 years before that, a different student had attempted to create a computer simulation of human military responses. The project had seemed straightforward enough. Input historical data, identify patterns, generate predictive models. The Academy's quantum computers were capable of processing strategic scenarios involving billions of variables, accounting for everything from individual soldier psychology to interstellar supply chain logistics. The simulation had run for 3 days before the computers began generating error messages that the technical support staff had never seen before. The error codes themselves had been works of art in their own way, consisting entirely of question marks, expletives in 17 different programming languages, and what appeared to be digital expressions of existential despair. When the lead programmer had finally managed to access the simulation's final output, they had found a single message displayed on every screen: calculation impossible. Subjects appeared to be making it up as they go. The computer system had required a complete rebuild. The programmer had required a career change. But perhaps the most instructive failure had occurred a decade earlier, when a joint research team from 4 different species had decided to approach the problem systematically. They had divided human history into manageable segments, analyzed each conflict according to established military theory, and created comprehensive flowcharts that traced the decision-making processes that led to various strategic outcomes. The flowcharts had been magnificent. They had been works of academic beauty, complex enough to require 3-dimensional holographic displays and sophisticated enough to impress even the most demanding committee reviewers. Each chart traced the logical progression from initial conditions through strategic considerations to final outcomes, creating elegant visual representations of cause and effect that would have made any military theorist weep with joy. There had been only one problem when the researchers had attempted to apply their flowcharts to predict human responses to hypothetical scenarios. Every single prediction had been wrong. Not partially wrong, not approximately incorrect, but spectacularly, comprehensively, magnificently wrong in ways that suggested that humans were deliberately trying to violate every principle of strategic thinking. The research team had spent another 6 months trying to identify where the methodology had failed. They had consulted with experts in psychology, sociology, anthropology, and quantum mechanics. They had revised their theoretical frameworks, recalibrated their analytical models, and expanded their databases to include every piece of available information about human decision-making processes. Their second attempt had been even more wrong than their first. Current students, accessing these historical records through increasingly desperate late-night research sessions, began to notice disturbing patterns in the data. Human military action seemed to follow a logic that was internally consistent but completely incompatible with any recognized strategic doctrine. Humans appeared to make tactical decisions based on factors that sophisticated analytical models couldn't even identify, let alone quantify. Even more troubling was the discovery that every major galactic power maintained what their databases politely termed Earth-specific contingency protocols. These protocols, the students learned, consisted primarily of variations on a single theme: avoid direct confrontation whenever possible, and if confrontation becomes unavoidable, prepare for scenarios that no reasonable strategic planner would consider likely. The Valdorian proctor, observing the growing expressions of panic among his students, allowed his bioluminescent patches to flicker in what was definitely amusement now. He had proctored this examination 47 times, and the progression was always the same. First came confidence, then confusion, then the gradual realization that their 3 years of military education had somehow failed to prepare them for the single most important strategic question they would ever encounter. One student, a promising young tactician from the Centurion Defense Academy, had reached the stage where they were actively considering whether answering the question was worth risking their academic career. Their 4 hands moved independently, one reaching for their stylus, another pulling up historical databases, a third running calculations on probability matrices, and the fourth apparently trying to strangle their own neck in a display of academic despair. The atmosphere in the examination hall had shifted from nervous anticipation to something approaching existential dread. This was supposed to be the culmination of their studies, the moment when years of theoretical knowledge would crystallize into practical wisdom. Instead, they were discovering that their entire education might have been missing a rather significant component. The Centurion, whose academic record included 3 commendations for strategic innovation and a thesis on multidimensional battlefield coordination that had impressed even the notoriously difficult Professor Vextar, finally made the decision that would define the remainder of their military career. With the kind of determination usually reserved for charging into orbital minefields, they began to write. Their answers started conventionally enough. They cited established doctrine, referenced classical strategic theory, and outlined the 17-step process for evaluating military responses to existential threats. Their analysis was methodical, comprehensive, and exactly the kind of response that would have earned top marks in any other context. They discussed resource allocation, force projection capabilities, alliance structures, and the psychological factors that influence strategic decision-making. For approximately 400 words, their response was a masterwork of military analysis. Then they reached the section where theoretical framework was supposed to meet practical application, and everything began to fall apart. The Academy's database systems, designed to support student research with access to millions of strategic analyses and historical case studies, began responding to queries about human military actions with increasing reluctance. Search algorithms that normally processed requests in milliseconds started taking several seconds, then minutes, to return results. When results did appear, they came with warning flags, uncertainty markers, and footnotes that seemed to multiply exponentially with each additional query. Centurion, following proper academic protocol, had begun cross-referencing their theoretical framework with historical examples of human military responses. This was standard practice for strategic analysis. Identify patterns, extract principles, apply lessons learned to current scenarios. The approach had worked flawlessly for every other species in the galactic community. It did not work for humans. Each historical example seemed to contradict the previous one. Humans had simultaneously demonstrated tactical brilliance and strategic incompetence, had won wars they should have lost and lost battles they should have won, had made decisions that violated every principle of military logic, yet somehow achieved their objectives anyway. The more data the Centurion accessed, the more contradictory the picture became. Their second hand began pulling up military simulation software, attempting to model human strategic responses using standard behavioral parameters. The software, which had successfully predicted the outcomes of every major galactic conflict for the past 2 centuries, processed the initial conditions, analyzed the variables, and returned a result that consisted entirely of error messages and what appeared to be a digital representation of a question mark having an existential crisis. The Centurion's third hand, operating on pure academic instinct, began accessing classified military databases that required special authorization codes. These were the archives that contained detailed analyses of real conflicts, not the sanitized case studies used for classroom instruction. Here, finally, they expected to find the comprehensive strategic assessments that would explain human military behavior. What they found instead were files marked with warning labels in 17 different languages. all variations on the same basic theme. Analysis incomplete. Recommend avoiding direct confrontation. The detailed reports that did exist read like the strategic equivalent of horror stories, filled with phrases like unprecedented tactical adaptability, complete disregard for established doctrine, and apparent ability to weaponize improvisation. One particularly disturbing report, filed by a Zephyrian military observer who had witnessed a human conflict, concluded with a recommendation that all galactic powers maintain what it termed strategic ambiguity regarding Earth. The report's author had noted that human military responses seemed to be influenced by factors that sophisticated analytical models couldn't account for, including what the observer had described as spite, stubbornness, and something called making it personal. The Centaurian's fourth hand, apparently operating independently of conscious control, began accessing the Academy's most restricted databases, the ones that contained information about current galactic military policies. Here, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic classification, they discovered something that made all four of their hands stop moving simultaneously. Every major military power in the galaxy maintained what their strategic planning documents referred to as Earth avoidant protocols. These weren't defensive strategies or containment policies. They were explicit instructions to avoid any situation that might require military action involving Earth or its human inhabitants. The documents made for fascinating reading, primarily because they revealed a level of institutional nervousness that was completely at odds with Earth's apparent military capabilities. Humans possessed nuclear weapons, which was concerning but not unprecedented. They had achieved faster-than-light travel, which was impressive but hardly unique. Their industrial capacity was significant but not overwhelming compared to established galactic powers. Yet every strategic assessment ended with the same recommendation: maintain friendly relations, avoid provocative actions, and under no circumstances create a situation that might require answering the question of what Earth would actually do in a military crisis. The Centurions stared at their examination tablet, where their partially completed answer sat like an accusation. They had begun with confidence, proceeded with growing unease, and now faced the uncomfortable realization that their entire military education had been constructed around a foundation of collective institutional denial. The databases weren't malfunctioning, the strategic analyses weren't incomplete due to lack of data. The entire galactic military establishment had simply agreed, through some unspoken consensus, that certain questions were better left unasked, and some strategic scenarios were better left unmodeled. Their answer, which had started as an academic exercise, had accidentally uncovered what appeared to be the galaxy's most successful intelligence operation, convincing everyone that Earth wasn't worth worrying about, while simultaneously ensuring that no one ever put that assumption to the test. The examination hall's environmental systems began working harder as the Centaurians' continued database access triggered automated alerts throughout the Academy's administrative network. Warning lights flickered in administrative offices, security protocols activated. Emergency faculty meetings were automatically scheduled. All because one student tried to answer a question that everyone knew better than to ask. The aftermath of the Centaurians' attempt to answer played out with a kind of choreographed panic that suggested the Academy had contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Within minutes, the examination hall's doors had sealed, emergency lighting had activated, and the proctor's bioluminescent patches had shifted to patterns that indicated either extreme amusement or preparation for ritual combat. The distinction was apparently subtle even among Valdorian physiology experts. An emergency faculty meeting materialized in the administrative wing with the efficiency of a military operation, which was ironic considering that most of the faculty had spent their careers studying military operations without ever expecting to participate in one. The assembled professors represented the finest strategic minds from across 17 different species, yet they filed into the conference room with the collective demeanor of students who had been caught cheating on an examination. The department head, a distinguished Altarian whose sensory stalks had achieved the perfect curl that indicated advanced academic achievement, began the meeting with the traditional bureaucratic incantation. "We have a situation." This was followed by the equally traditional academic response of 17 different species attempting to avoid eye contact simultaneously. which created a fascinating display of evolutionary diversity in the expression of institutional embarrassment. The situation, as it was delicately explained, was that a student had accidentally triggered what the Academy's protocols classified as a Category 7 academic incident. Category 7 incidents were theoretical constructs that existed primarily to complete classification systems, the kind of scenarios that bureaucratic completeness demanded, but that no reasonable administrator expected to encounter. The classification system itself was a masterwork of academic denial. Category 1 incidents involved students cheating on examinations. Category 2 involved students questioning established doctrine. Category 3 involved students discovering minor inconsistencies in theoretical frameworks. Categories 4 through 6 covered various forms of academic misconduct and intellectual rebellion. Category 7 incidents occurred when students discovered that their entire field of study was based on an elaborate collective agreement to avoid examining certain uncomfortable realities. The Centurion's examination answer, which had begun as a straightforward application of strategic theory, had accidentally uncovered the galaxy's most successful example of what military historians would eventually term strategic cognitive dissonance. Every major military power maintained elaborate defense systems designed to counter threats that their strategic planning explicitly avoided identifying. The faculty's response to this revelation followed patterns that were themselves worthy of academic study. The professor of advanced strategic theory suggested that perhaps the examination question should be revised to avoid future incidents. The head of military history recommended that certain database access protocols should be reviewed. The Dean of Academic Affairs proposed that the entire situation should be classified under educational privacy statutes and never discussed again. What none of them suggested was that perhaps they should actually attempt to answer the question. This was not an oversight. This was the result of 3 centuries of institutional wisdom that had recognized a fundamental truth about strategic planning. Some scenarios were too dangerous to analyze, not because the analysis might fail, but because it might succeed. The uncomfortable reality that no one wanted to acknowledge was that Earth's apparent military weakness was not a strategic assessment. It was a strategic necessity. Every military power in the galaxy had independently reached the conclusion that humans were best left alone, not because they posed no threat, but because they posed a threat that couldn't be properly categorized. Humans fought wars with a combination of strategic innovation, tactical stubbornness, and apparent randomness that made their military responses impossible to predict. They had won conflicts by ignoring established doctrine, had achieved objectives by pursuing strategies that shouldn't have worked, and had demonstrated a disturbing tendency to treat warfare as a problem-solving exercise rather than a formal strategic discipline. The galaxy's military establishment had responded to this challenge with characteristic sophistication. They had collectively agreed to pretend the problem didn't exist, while quietly implementing policies designed to ensure that they would never have to test their assumption. Earth avoidance protocols weren't defensive measures. They were prophylactic policies designed to prevent the kind of strategic thinking that might lead to awkward questions about what would happen if humanity ever decided to take galactic politics seriously. The examination question existed not to test students' knowledge of human military capabilities, but to identify students who were dangerous enough to actually attempt such an analysis. It served as an early warning system for the kind of intellectual curiosity that might threaten the comfortable fiction that had allowed galactic civilization to develop without having to account for the strategic implications of a species that appeared to treat military doctrine as a set of suggestions rather than rules. The Centurion, whose academic career now hung in the balance, sat in the sealed examination hall while their professors debated whether to classify their answer as a security breach, an academic violation, or a philosophical catastrophe. Their 4 hands had returned to the examination tablet, where their incomplete answer served as evidence of the galaxy's most successful intelligence operation, convincing everyone that some questions were too dangerous to ask, while never admitting that the danger lay not in the asking, but in the possibility of receiving an answer. The proctor's bioluminescent patches had settled into a pattern that veteran academy staff would recognize as institutional resignation mixed with professional admiration. Another class of military strategists was about to graduate with the uncomfortable knowledge that their education had been deliberately incomplete, designed to produce strategic thinkers who were sophisticated enough to analyze any military scenario except the one they were most likely to encounter. Outside the examination hall, the Galaxy continued its elaborate dance of strategic planning that carefully avoided any situation that might require them to discover what Earth would actually do. It was, the proctor reflected, probably the most successful military strategy in galactic history, achieving perfect deterrence through collective, willful ignorance. The question remained on the examination tablets, unanswered and unanswerable, serving its intended purpose as a reminder that sometimes the most important strategic wisdom lay in knowing which questions not to ask. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Academy's restricted archives, automated systems continued their eternal task of cataloging and cross-referencing strategic data from across the galaxy. These systems, designed by the finest artificial intelligences that bureaucratic budgets could procure, operated with the kind of relentless efficiency that made organic beings grateful they had never achieved true digital consciousness. The systems had been processing human military data for decades, attempting to identify patterns, extract principles, and generate predictive models with the same methodical precision they applied to every other species in their databases. The results of this analysis were stored in files that grew larger each year, filled with increasingly complex algorithms and progressively more desperate attempts to reconcile human military behavior with established strategic theory. Deep within these files, buried beneath layers of classification and encryption, lay the artificial intelligence's final assessment of human military capabilities. The document consisted of a single line of code that had been running continuously for 17 years. Error 404. Logic not found. Recommend manual order. The systems had, in their own digital way, reached the same conclusion as their organic counterparts. Some problems were better left unsolved. They continued to process data, generate reports, and maintain their databases with perfect mechanical efficiency, while quietly flagging any query related to human strategic analysis with warnings that translated roughly to, "Are you absolutely certain you want to know?" This digital conspiracy of silence extended throughout the Galactic Information Network, creating a fascinating example of cross-species technological cooperation. Artificial intelligences from dozens of different civilizations had independently developed similar responses to the human strategic analysis problem, leading to what computer scientists would eventually term distributed cognitive avoidance protocols. The irony was not lost on the more philosophically inclined systems administrators, who noted that their most advanced analytical tools had essentially learned to practice willful ignorance as a survival strategy. The computers, in other words, had developed what organic beings would recognize as common sense. Back in the examination hall, the Centaurian had finally stopped trying to complete their answer and had instead begun contemplating the broader implications of their discovery. Their academic career might be in ruins, but they had inadvertently uncovered evidence of the galaxy's most successful intelligence operation. One so successful that even the participants weren't entirely sure they were participating in it. The other students, meanwhile, had gradually come to understand that their silence was not merely academic cowardice, but institutional wisdom. They sat in their seats with the profound stillness of those who had glimpsed the edge of knowledge and decided that some territories were better left unexplored. The Mollusk Coalition representative had stopped producing slime trails entirely, their natural secretions apparently having concluded that geometric expressions of anxiety were inadequate for the current situation. The Zephyrians' crystalline structure had achieved a frequency that suggested they were attempting to harmonize with the fundamental vibrations of the universe, possibly in hopes of discovering that reality was less complicated than their education had led them to believe. What none of them realized was that similar scenes were playing out simultaneously across 17 different star systems, wherever advanced military academies administered their final examinations. The question appeared on tablets and holographic displays throughout the galaxy, creating a synchronized moment of institutional panic that would have been impressive if anyone had been foolish enough to coordinate it deliberately. On Rigel Prime, a class of crystalline collective strategists stared at their examination interfaces with the collective bewilderment of a species that prided itself on logical thinking. On Vega Station, a group of Aquatic Federation military scholars experienced what their physiologists would later classify as synchronized cognitive distress syndrome. Even on the technologically advanced worlds of the Silicon Brotherhood, where artificial intelligences served as both students and instructors, The question generated processing errors that created feedback loops reminiscent of digital meditation. The beautiful irony of the situation was that each academy believed they were the only institution experiencing this particular form of educational crisis. The galaxy's commitment to avoiding the human strategic analysis problem was so complete that even the institutions responsible for military education had never compared notes about their shared avoidance strategies. This accidental coordination created a fascinating example of emergent galactic behavior. Thousands of military strategists across dozens of species simultaneously discovering that their education had been deliberately incomplete, yet none of them able to discuss their discovery with colleagues from other institutions due to the very same institutional policies that had created the problem in the first place. The result was a galaxy-wide conspiracy of silence that maintained itself through pure bureaucratic inertia, creating a situation where the most important strategic question in galactic politics remained unasked, not through any coordinated effort, but through the simple expedient of everyone independently deciding it was someone else's problem. But after all, some mysteries were too dangerous to solve, especially when the mystery in question involved a species that had somehow convinced the entire galaxy to leave them alone, without ever having to explain why such caution might be necessary.